Loops in programming are a way to repeat lines of code. Looping, or repeating, is often referred to as iterating. In this lesson, we will take a look at 4 types of loops: the while loop, the do-while loop, the for loop, and the for-each loop. We have here a scene with each of the loops and a script attached to an object. We will be monitoring the output in the console view. In the while loop script, we can see that we have a variable named cups in the sink, which is set to 4. In the start method, we have our while loop. The structure of the while loop is as follows. We start with the keyword while. Then in parentheses, we have a conditional. The content of the loop will continue to repeat as long as the conditional evaluates to true. The code in the braces represents the body of the loop. It is this code that gets repeated. We can see that this loop will print, "I've washed a cup," then it will decrement the variable cups in the sink. The loop repeats these steps while the value of cups in the sink is greater than 0. Let's see this code in action. When we enable the script and run our scene, we can see in the console that 4 cups have been washed. The next loop we are going to look at is the do-while loop. The do-while loop functions almost identically to the while loop with one major difference. While loops test the condition before the loop body, however do-while loops test the condition at the end of the body. This difference means that the body of a do-while loop is guaranteed to run at least once. Here is the do-while script. We can see that we have a Boolean variable named should continue. This variable is set to false. Next we have a do-while loop. Notice the syntax of the do-while loop. We start with the keyword do, followed by open and close braces. Whatever code is in between these braces makes up the body of the loop. After the body is the while keyword, followed by the conditional. In this case, the loop will only continue while the variable should continue is equal to true. We can see that the variable is set to false, so this conditional will resolve to false and the loop will exit. Finally, notice the semicolon after the conditional. While loops don't have the semicolon, but do-while loops do. Back in our scene, we will enable the do-while script and run it. We can see that the phrase "Hello World" is printed to the console. Even though our condition was set to resolve to false from the beginning, the body of a do-while loop always runs at least once. Now we will take a look at the for loop. The for loop functions similarly to the while loop, but uses a different syntax. Here in the for loop script, you can see that we have a variable called num_enemies that is set to 3. Next is the actual for loop, which uses the following syntax. We start with the keyword for, then in parentheses, we have 3 specific sections. The first section is optional and gives us a place to declare and initialize any variables we wish to use. This section will run one time at the beginning of the loop. Next we have the conditional, which must be supplied. This conditional will be evaluated before every iteration of the loop. Finally, we have an optional section that allows us to increment or decrement any variables we would like. This section will run after every iteration of the loop. Note that it is a semicolon and not a comma that separates the different sections. Following the parentheses is the 2 braces and the body of the for loop. Due to its syntax, a for loop is very useful for loops that involve counting when the number of iterations is known. In this example, we can see that this loop has created a variable called I and set it to 0. This loop will run while I is less than the variable num_enemies, which in this case equals 3. Finally, you can see that after every iteration of the loop, I will be increased by 1. In the body of the loop, the words "creating enemy number" will be printed along with the value of I. It is worth noting that usually in programming counting begins at 0 and not 1. Therefore, in this loop, the variable I starts at 0. Let's enable the for loop script and run it. Predictably, in the console view, we will see that 3 enemies were created. Let's take a look at our last loop, the for-each loop. This loop is very useful for iterating through collections like arrays. If you are not familiar with arrays, you can view the lesson on arrays linked below. In the for-each loop script, you can see that we have created an array of 3 strings and given them some basic values. Then we have the for-each loop. The for-each loop, basically, loops through a collection item by item until it reaches the end of the collection. Once it reaches the end, it stops. The for-each loop uses the keyword for-each, followed by parentheses. Inside the parentheses, we declare a variable of the same type as the collection or array we want to loop through. In this case, we created a variable called item that is of type string. We follow this with the keyword in and the name of the collection that we wish to loop through. Inside the body of the loop, we are printing out the variable item that we created above. Every time the loop iterates, item will be the value of the next element in the collection or array. In this way, it is easy to access each element of the collection without worrying about how big the collection is. Something worth noting is that you cannot alter the elements of a collection using a for each loop. If you need to modify an element, you will want to use a for loop. When we enable the script and run our scene, we can see that even though we printed the variable item each time, all of the strings in the array are written in the console. This is because the value of the item variable changed after every iteration.